in some sense, reparation is impossible. There is an incommensurability between the grief and the grievance. And as we keep reading and hearing and noting in a whole variety of ways, the damage can't be undone. So on the one hand, that renders reparation a sort of impossibility, a kind of aporetic notion, and yet that is, to my mind, not enough to then dismiss that other side of the imperative to engage in some form of reparative experimentation. So therefore the question becomes, well, what does reparation mean when it's impossible?
If we follow your thought, and we follow this idea of the incommensurability between the collapsing of ecologies and the restoration of ecologies, then how do we see the double movement of repair and reparation happening?
One of the things that has become key to my thinking around these things is a sort of gesture of refusal of the temporality of imminence that accompanies concerns and debates and questions around ecology, right? This idea that, for instance, in the case of repair and ecological forms of repair and reparation, this idea that something must be done right now because otherwise, catastrophe will ensue and the apocalypse will be upon us, and therefore restoration needs, as it were, to be some kind of preemptive and preventative project that consists precisely in a sort of turning back of the ecological clock, as it were, of a whole array of socio-ecological and cultural and political processes. Take on the tragic dimension of ecological politics today. So, as you rightly say, for me, thinking about ecological reparation is not a matter of, in fact, what I would call a sort of a restoration, a kind of turning back of a reversal, as it were, of the damage that has been done, but rather a question of what comes next. Some apocalypse is here, but the apocalypse is not the same as the end of everything as such. And so that is indeed, I think, where the question of experimentation and improvisation come in, which is if we take seriously simultaneously these two dimensions of the impossibility and the imperative of repair and reparation, then what does a form of experimentation that dramatizes that impossibility and that makes something out of some reparative mode of practice and some reparative mode of thought possible, even whilst affirming the impossibility of some form of cure or reparation.
You bring cosmos to ecology in your work, and I wanted to ask you if you can tell us a bit more about this gesture. What does it mean to talk of, let's say, the cosmo-ecological workshop, the workshop where this kind of improvisation or experimentation with this open future happens? Why is it a cosmo-ecological workshop?
To me, when we talk about ecological destruction and devastation and damage and so on, and therefore of ecological reparation, we are not only talking about environmental or as we used to call them, sort of natural processes of degradation and destruction, but of the destruction of entire forms of life that involve at once environmental dimensions, but as somebody like Félix Guattari would argue, there is an environmental ecology, but to that we must add also a social and a mental ecology, right? Ecologies of collectives and indeed of forms of subjectivity. And I think when we think about these three ecologies in the context, in sort of post-colonial and non-Western contexts, these three ecologies simultaneously involve the conditions of existence for a whole array of other kinds of beings, indeed of other sort of cosmological arrangements. That role of expanding, as it were, our understanding of the ecological to encompass not only relations between humans and non-humans, but also relations between all sorts and manner of beings beyond a kind of the naturalist metaphysics of the modern West. But on the other hand, what it does is to also destabilize both the kind of ontological and the axiological dimensions that are normally associated with the ecological. Right? It introduces a kind of indeterminacy that impinges precisely upon the question of what next. I focus on this marvelous story of a collective of priests who, in the wake of the 2011 tsunami in Japan, encountered that after the tsunami, about 6 months later, there was something of a profusion of ghosts in and around the devastated area, causing not just appearances and stories and so on of people that had encountered them, but also a whole new sort of wave of suffering and sorrow of people that were mourning, of people that were possessed by some of these ghosts, etc., etc. And what these collective of priests engaged in was precisely a kind of radically experimental, pragmatic, improvisational process of trying to essentially, in practice, give some sort of response, I would say, to this question of what ecological reparation might entail by setting up this mobile cafe in which they would invite the survivors of the tsunami to gather together to share their stories and drink tea and so on, while simultaneously learning how to enter into conversations with these ghosts that were among them, and often speaking through the bodies of some of these survivors. And so it becomes, in the course of these practices, evident that what needs to be repaired is not the entire and vast sort of material destruction that the tsunami brings about, or indeed the ripples of it that then take effect through the Fukushima nuclear disaster and so on, but also the very relationships between the living and the dead that have been teared asunder and have been damaged as a result not only of the tsunami but of an entire history of devaluation of certain kinds of practices. In the wake of the tsunami and of the ecological and cosmological forms of devastation that brings about, the question they pose is not how do we restore what had been broken, how do we, as it were, redeem the present from the disaster that now characterizes it, but rather, again, what forms of life and death, what kinds of relationships between those who are still living and those who have died or indeed had died before the tsunami and whose bonds with the living, the tsunami itself tore apart, forcing them into this kind of ghostly wondering. How do we imagine ways of reweaving those kinds of ecological and cosmological relationships? Not indeed to bring, as it were, the dead back to life, nor indeed to enable the living to go back to their lives. That is where the impossibility of reparation makes itself felt. But nevertheless, in order to craft collective forms of being together that respond to what has happened, right, and that as such make life worth living, even in the aftermath of such radical form of destruction. Learning to attend to them, to respond to them, to take their presence seriously is simultaneously, the challenge and the task of learning how to regenerate the collective imagination by conjoining and thinking together the notion of reparation and repair politically. It brings me back again to this idea of the regeneration of the imagination, right, and to the possibility of imagining a political form of reparation that is more fugitive than redemptive, and that therefore is not state-centered, but rather seeks to gather and create, indeed, and fabricate the collective means by which forms of thinking, of living, of being together otherwise might be rendered possible, might be engendered, inside and in spite of the kind of historical destructions brought about by states. Insofar as there are spirits, and it is a thoroughly realist problem, that of learning to attend to them, to take them seriously, and to respond to them, then in this sense, spirituality is a radical problematization of the very distinction between religion and secularism, rather than a mere sort of non-denominational form of religion.